Canada is going to be able to compete in this world. The world is changing, as you say. We can no longer count on having low-skilled jobs that pay a lot of high wages. I think one of the things that globalization has done has taken those low-skilled jobs and taken them offshore. And I don't think they're coming back. But at the same time, for a country like Canada, we're going to have to compete on the basis of our brain power. So to what extent can we design great products and services? To what extent can we manufacture creatively? To what extent can we add value to our products rather than simply mass producing products at a very low cost per unit because our labor costs are so low? I also think that one of the reasons or one of the factors that has driven globalization is low transportation costs and low wages in places like China. But things go in cycles, so as oil prices increase, our transportation costs are going to increase, and the advantage that, that places like China and India have in terms of being closer for transportation, those will dissipate. And also I think there's going to be some pressures in China, especially for wages to start rising. I think one of the great parts of the China miracle is that they've encouraged or persuaded their workers to work at wages that are quite low. I think as China prospers, the workers and the consumers are going to want a bigger stake, bigger share of that pie. So wages in China are going to creep up, and their wage advantage versus us here in North America, that gap is going to narrow, or their advantage will narrow. Absolutely. In fact, it has to be. If you are a manufacturer in Canada or North America anymore who is just simply mass producing things without much thought as to what goes into that product or how it's designed. There's probably no such animal anymore in North America anyway. I think the only ones that are surviving are the ones that have built creativity into their product, built creativity into the service offering that goes with the product. And so I think, to the extent we've got smart, educated, creative people working in manufacturing in North America, we're going to do just fine. I mean, one thing we have to remind ourselves is that there aren't that many manufacturing jobs today. About 15% of jobs here in Ontario or across Canada are your traditional blue-collar manufacturing jobs. So we shouldn't have this impression that somehow there's an army of workers who are in the factories and on the assembly lines, working. It's just not the case. In fact, it hasn't been the case in North America for probably 30, 40, 50 years. We've been a service economy since the 50s. So, and we've done a great job of creating jobs for the creative class, for creative workers. So I have no concerns that we won't create those jobs. It's more, I think, supply pushed. If we have a lot of creative people coming out of our schools and more coming out of our universities, they will create their own jobs, or they'll create their own conditions for employment. To the extent that there's a lot of creative, smart people out there available to work, employers, entrepreneurs are going to figure out a way to employ them. I wouldn't call the distinction between manufacturing and design a split. I think more and more manufacturing has to be well designed, and by well designed I mean smart managers who are designing manufacturing processes that are creative, that reduce costs, that make turnaround more quick in the manufacturing process, and also design of new products that are better suited to customer needs. So a manufacturer who is not a designer has a very limited future. In fact, I'd argue doesn't even exist today. Successful manufacturers here in North America are almost by definition successful designers. So I think the distinction doesn't really exist, but for us to make sure that we are picking up that design piece of manufacturing, I think more and more what governments need to do is to make sure that we have as many of our kids going on to university as possible. Now they don't, in fact, we have enough scientists and engineers right now, so we don't need more scientists and engineers. We need kids to take courses that they want to take. But to the extent we've got more students coming out who can think, so that often means liberal arts and humanities, they're going to figure out ways to redesign production. They're going to figure out ways to redesign production processes and products. And so I think a big thing that we can do here in Ontario and in Canada from the individual side is for young people to get as far as they can in university before they get into the workforce. For their parents to encourage them to go to university, not to just take the first job out of high school. Those kids who get a university degree are just going to do so much better over their lifetime than those who don't. For the government, I think what it means is continue to ensure that we're investing adequately in post-secondary education. Now, there's a long distance between a kid going to university and a great design coming out of a production process. But the link is there, and we have to be patient, and we can't expect government to do something today that's going to solve whatever problems we have in the manufacturing sector tomorrow. It's going to take a long time. And I'm confident that Canadians and Ontarians and our individuals, our businesses, and our governments can do the right thing. I wouldn't trade our economy here in Ontario for Germany. We have higher prosperity by and large in Ontario versus Germany. So I think we've got as good an economy going here as anywhere, and we are not going to succeed unless we draw on the brainpower of our workers and our managers. I think we're on that track already, and what's forcing us to be on that track is trade. And so we've looked at, to what extent have Chinese imports and our manufactured goods affected our Canadian manufacturers. The ones that survived or that actually grew despite the onslaught of Chinese imports were the ones that had higher value added in their production process, had more creativity, more creative workers at their factory than just assembly line people. So I think there's already a move afoot to make our factories more creative. I guess the key thing that we want to be thinking of is flexibility. To what extent can our factory change the output from an hour-to-hour basis depending on customer demand changes? And when I look at where in the world would I go to find the raw materials for more flexibility, more creativity in a factory? I wouldn't go to China. I wouldn't go to Brazil. I wouldn't go to India. I would come right here to America and Canada, to North America. We have the creativity, we have the flexibility, and we just have the institutions and the culture that are going to push us more towards flexible, creative factories. And I think there's examples out there already of firms that are doing that, and I think there's just going to be more. We have to differentiate between an industry and occupations. So take General Motors, for example. General Motors is a manufacturer. And yet, I would bet fully half of their employees don't go near an assembly line ever. They're working in their legal department, they're working in their design department. So when we talk about manufacturers, more and more of those workers in those manufacturing firms are in these creative occupations. It's because we've been able to be so good at automating and to have machines do the heavy lifting and the turning and move the assembly line that fewer and fewer people are required to do those jobs. The dullness that you're talking about is on the task itself, and it is a dull task if you're doing the same thing over and over. But where the Japanese gave us the big scare in the auto industry was their workers, they treated their workers as human beings with brains, not just hands. And they had things like quality circles. They taught them statistical process control so they could map how well their process was doing and when it was getting out of control, and they could then stop it. I think we've done a lot of that here in North America already. And so I think there's going to be, in the actual manufacturing job, the working class job, there's always going to be some drudgery and some undesirability about that. But there's fewer and fewer of those jobs around. And I think the challenge we've got, and not so much the challenge, I think the trend in those jobs is to be less dirty, less noisy, less unsafe, and more clean jobs jobs where the worker is actually expected to think. And so I think it's the way we should think about manufacturing firms that needs to just evolve to the reality. Most manufacturing firms have lots of workers who are doing creative things around design, process control, and a smaller and smaller percentage of the workers are actually on the floor doing that drudgery of work. Our average wages have been going up as workers have shifted from the blue-collar manufacturing to the white-collar creative jobs. So now some would argue they're not going fast enough, and I'd be in that cadre as well, that we want faster growth in our wages. But it's hard to look at the statistics and see that our wages have come down as manufacturing jobs have fallen and other jobs have increased. One thing we need to remind ourselves is a lot of those blue-collar working class jobs were not great jobs. They didn't pay that well. We all have visions of the $35 an hour assembly line worker at General Motors and Chrysler, but most manufacturing jobs are nowhere near that attractive in compensation terms. So losing jobs rather, that are drudgery, repetitive, unsafe, noisy, and don't pay that well, I'm not going to lose a whole bunch of sleep over that. I think the challenge in our society is, as you say, is to create those jobs, and I think we've got a pretty good track record at creating those jobs. How much economic value have I created when my factory is running or when my call center is working, and how much value added above and beyond what I paid my outside suppliers? So value added can go two ways. It can go to profits of the owners, it can go to wages of the workers, and most value added goes to wages. Something like 2/3 of any value added, which is what goes into our GDP, goes to the workers in the form of wages. So as productivity increases, so do wages. Now, in certain parts of the business cycle, profits may be winning out at the expense of wages. Capitalists and laborers are fighting over the spoils. But it's been pretty stable since the 1920s in terms of how much of our value added goes to labor and how much of it goes to capital. And so the only way that workers are going to earn higher wages is if we have more productive economy, if the jobs they're doing are more productive. And it's not so much that the workers have to be more productive. I mean, they do, but a lot of it's to do with how much capital has their employer invested behind them. How well thought out is the production process? Has the firm designed products and services that people want to buy? And a lot of that goes into value added. And I would also add that innovation and productivity are they're two sides of the flip sides of the same coin. Innovation means, can I make a product quicker? Can I have a better production process? Can I find something that people will pay more for? Those things all drive productivity.